Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Forgotten Football Clubs podcast. My name is Rory, going to be your host for this evening, and I'm joined, as always, by Phil O'Rourke. How you doing, Phil?
What's up, Rory? Good to be back.
Yep, absolutely good to be back, going through another couple of clubs. And we're joined by a special guest tonight, Mr. Phil Harrison. Phil, how's it going?
Very well, guys. How you doing? You okay?
So tonight we're going to be going through another two clubs from Phil's book, Forgotten Football Clubs. So last week, obviously, we focused on the first two clubs in the book, which were Sporting Fingal FC of the Republic of Ireland and FC Amsterdam from the Netherlands. So obviously that was just to get things kicked off. Format's going to change slightly now, where we're basically just going to pick two at random every week and we'll go through them. So to announce tonight's teams, first of all, Phil O'Rourke and Phil Harrison are going to be discussing a team from Albania called KF Spartak Tirana. And then after that, I'm going to be discussing the Belarusian side, or former Belarusian side, FC Partizan Minsk. So, guys, why don't you just kind of start off? Phil Harrison, we'll start with yourself. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Tirana just before we jump straight into it?
Okay, yeah, Spartak Tirana. They were born into the early communist era of Albania. Okay, so they were founded in 1950, shortly after communism had come to the fore in Albania, which happened post Second World War. They were known as the team of the trade unions, so they had strong links to trade unions of Albania at the time, which were, effectively like there was a trains and there was the kind of industrial plants. So they were the team that represented those. Okay, and they were in existence initially for just 9 years. So they came into formation in 1950, the same year that Dynamo Tirana came into existence as well. So two teams entered into the Albanian campionati, who were both from the city of Tirana. However, both sides had different degrees of success. Whereas Dynamo went on to become one of the big teams of the era, Spartak only managed to play in the campionati for 3 seasons. So they played 1954, 1955 and 1957, where they were relegated, finishing bottom of the division without winning a game of their 14 league games. And in 1959, they ceased to exist. Although a kind of Renaissance club did come into existence for a short period between 2012 and 2020, but again, dissolved.
Yeah, I did see actually that there had been a couple of iterations of the club, and one had sort of been reformed in 2012, a sort of Phoenix club, if you like. Obviously, some people may have already drawn the links between, we're discussing KF Spartak Tirana, whereas there is another team with a very, very similar name, which is FC Spartak Tirana. Now, is there any link between those two clubs? Is there any form of link to it? Obviously, we don't want to cause any confusion, so just to kind of clear the air with that, first of all.
No, well, I mean, it's the only link is that it's kind of fans of historic football are the ones that kind of wanted to create this, kind of Renaissance club. So there is no link other than kind of nostalgia and historical kind of nostalgia. That's the link, really.
Okay, so that's a nice bit of background then. So it sounds like they're obviously a bit of an older club, quite a historic club. Phil, was there any reason why you chose to write about Spartak Tirana?
Any club that I picked out always kind of, for whatever reason, just kind of popped out. One of the reasons actually is what you mentioned there, Rory, is that there was two clubs of the kind of same nature or the same name. And originally I thought they were both linked when I first looked. Then obviously when I do my research and stuff, I'm like, hang on, these are two separate clubs. Like Phil mentioned there as well, Spartak Tirana, or KF Spartak Tirana, then there was Dynamo Tirana, and there was a bit of a, if I'm right in saying, Phil, there was a bit of a social difference between the two clubs. So Dynamo were seen as more of a kind of elite club, where Spartak were seen more of a working class club. Would that be correct?
That would be correct. And of course, Dynamo were the team of the Sigurimi, were the secret police.
Secret police, yeah.
And Partizani were the team of the army. and Spartak were the team of the trade unions. So they were on different. Although everything was kind of in communist Albania, everything was tied to kind of the rule of the party. They represented different factions of society.
Mm. And yeah, Rory, that was basically one of the things that intrigued me when I researched it, when I kind of dug a little bit deeper. As I said, originally it was because I thought there was two clubs of the same name, but these accidents kind of happen. And I stumbled upon this kind of cultural differences between football clubs, which Phil will probably be able to tell you even more about, because Phil is the guy, the expert on Albanian football. Phil, I suppose people will probably be wondering, you have, you're an Englishman. Why Albanian football?
Yeah, well, it's something that I'm presently writing my own book about, and the only thing I can say is it kind of like it's. If a place is remote and it's got a football team, I'm always more interested in going there, to be honest. And it stems back to like a 1988 qualifier that England played in Tirana. And there was a very kind of, you can see it on YouTube, there's a very prominent film about it's like a BBC intro to the game. And all these images of what appeared to be a very kind of impoverished country came onto the screen. And I don't know, it's just, when something grabs your attention, that grabbed my attention. And from there on, it was I was trying to source as much information I could using the kind of dual vehicles of the European Football Yearbook and World Soccer Magazine to find out anything I could about Albania. I've been doing that ever since. I did get a chance to go there shortly after communism fell in 1992. And it was still quite a rural country, but did manage to get into Tirana to watch a couple of games in Tirana. And now I've alluded to myself, presently in the process of writing a book on the history of Albanian football, which I believe will be the first book of its type in the English language. And I've created some great friendships with Albanians who've contributed so much information to it. It's really brought the book alive. They've talked to me about what the match day experience was like. One guy who I speak to, I said to him, "Oh, really? It sounds great." I said, "I really wish I knew somebody who kind of like who was part of the football culture at that time." He goes, "Oh, my dad used to play for a team." I was like, "Come on, tell me more about that." Going back to this story about his dad, who played for a second division Albanian team, who were always pushing for promotion, and they were a team called Kames Dati, who were also based in Tirana, but they were up in the kind of top northern sort of territories of Tirana. And he kind of regaled this incredible story about his dad's history, how he was on the cusp of kind of signing for 17 Nendori, who are now FK Tirana. But he was better at agriculture. He was an agriculturalist or agronomist. And because he was so good at that, they stopped him from becoming a professional footballer. So everything during that time period was based on what you were good at. It was a socialist country, and it was like if you were earmarked for a particular job, you did that job, and all your dreams came secondary to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's really interesting what you're saying, and just to kind of go back to the start from what you said there, it's like whenever, maybe not so much Scotland, but whenever your team are playing in Europe, and everyone knows you could get drawn against the French team, German team, all these places that relatively are close by, but there's something that bit more special about away days at a place where you barely go, or against a club that's maybe a little bit smaller than yours and you're playing in the qualifiers, but just to kind of take it back to teams as well, it's like a lot of places in a lot of these countries where as footballing nations are maybe seen as still kind of getting there almost, sometimes still finding their feet. So you often hear stories about people who will have had parents or family members who've maybe played for different teams to some degree, but then had to go off and do other stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, they did have one specific player who was very important to the history not only of Spartak Tirana, but the history of Partizan Tirana and for the Albanian national team. And that was a guy called Loro Barici. Now, Loro Barici is widely regarded as the finest Albanian player of all time. There are other players who fall into that kind of category, but he's the prototype for the kind of Albanian footballing superstar. He originally played for Vlasnia, who are a side based in the north of the country, from the city of Skoda. But he left Albania in 1937. Sorry, no, he was playing for Vlasnia in 1937. He left Albania in 1941 to go and study in Rome. And whilst in Rome, he trained with the university, the La Sapienza University in Rome, and he was spotted by Lazio, and Lazio signed him, and he played for Lazio for 2 years. And he was a tall, elegant footballer, good on the ball, bit of a goal scorer as well. So he was a very talented footballer. And at this point, he must have thought that he was going to kind of transpose these gifts that he had upon a bigger audience in Italy. However, the one thing that was in his way was that he was also in the same team as Silvio Piola, who was who played in the same position as him, basically, an Italian superstar who just won the World Cup with Italy. He was just a superb footballer all round. So it gave Baricci limited chances in the first team. So in 1943, he decided to return to an Albania that had just kind of been freed from the Italian fascists and now was heading into an area the German fascists had taken over the country. So he went home in 1943, and within a couple of days of the boat landing in Vlora in Albania, Silvio Pioli was sold to Juventus. So he'd left the country. I'm thinking, I'm never going to get into this side because of this player who's playing in my role. And by the time he got home, he'd left for another club anyway. So, yeah. But, Lauro Baricci's, he signed for Spartak in 1957, and he was a player manager for them that year. But unfortunately, in that year, they were relegated. So, and 2 years later, they were dissolved. And there's often the question as to why they were dissolved. And in my opinion, it was because around 1957, Albania had fallen out with the Soviet Union. They were very close to Stalin. And in 1957, after 12 years of being kind of like very close to the Soviet Union and kind of and copying all of their prototypes socially and in sport, Spartak became obsolete, and I think they were dissolved because they were more of a Soviet model.
Right, I see. Okay. So there's that kind of element of internal Soviet politics or Iron Curtain politics that kind of came in with that. And I can imagine as well, obviously you'd need to look into it, but I'd imagine the same happened with quite a few other teams, not just in Albania, but across the entire Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union itself.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, in Albania, in the first division, out of all the 8 clubs, in 1957, 5 of the clubs had the kind of prefix of Puna, which meant work. A very socialist thing, but after 1957, all those 5 teams changed their name. So it looked like there was a slight kind of they were trying to erase Soviet influence on Albanian society. And that proved to be the case over the course of the coming history. They no longer wanted to be affiliated with the Soviet Union, and it got to the point in 1961 where they completely broke from the Soviet Union and allied themselves with China. So there was of course that sort of big historic split. That's really interesting. It's quite good that we kind of lay out this political context as well, because unsurprisingly it's the backdrop for the dissolution and the founding of a lot of clubs, not just in Eastern Europe but across the rest of Europe, the world, and wherever else as well. So I really enjoy that context, and I find it all really quite interesting. It's something that lays the ground for a lot of further research as well. But over in the footballing side of things, Phil O'Rourke, why don't you tell us some of the success stories, some of the results, and some of the things that happened while Spartak Tirana were still playing?
Yeah, well, I mean, Phil Harrison there mentioned Lauro Baricci quite rightly. There was an actual poll done, so each, I think it's only European nations got to pick their best ever player or their golden player, if you like. And for Albania, you can look it up. Loro Barici, I always struggle to pronounce it, was the man that the Albanians picked. So he is basically voted the best ever player to come from Albania. When I was doing the interview with Phil for the book, he basically told me to go look him up on YouTube and stuff like that. So you can actually watch him on YouTube. So if you want to go have a look at that, he was look, he was a good little player back in his day. I'd imagine he'd be able to contend in the Premier League. Obviously different eras and stuff like that. And people will say, "Oh, how will you ever know?" But he looked like he had quick feet. He looked like like the ball just stuck to his feet. I think they called him Phil Little Puskas, was it?
That was another player actually, man. That was a player called Panajot Pano.
That's it. Pano as well. Yeah, he's the other one that I was going to mention.
They were similar. They were a similar type, mate. That's exactly right. They were the players who kind of went at the game. You know what I mean? Yeah. They would kind of try to impose themselves upon a game. From the kickoff, and there's lots of like footage of both. Barici during the Balkans Cup, which is Albania's only international honour. They won that in 1946. But you can see some footage of that, and you see little pockets of play by Barici, which are excellent. And then the other guy, Panajot Pano, there's quite a
little Puskas. Yeah, he's quite nifty. I'd say he was probably a close runner up to the best ever Albanian player.
He certainly looked the business. He was, as you say, he was known as Little Puskas. He had two nicknames, and the other one was Umbretti, which means the king. So he was known simply as the king as well. So two really there at the kind of top end of when people talk about great Albanian players. Their names are always in the argument. I think it's around that kind of corner of Europe. There's always the kind of emphasis on the great technician of football. There was always the kind of playmaker, the flair player. Whereas sometimes in British football, particularly, there's more of a kind of emphasis on solidity than flair, isn't there? But there you've got that kind of metronomic kind of tempo setter who's good on the ball, who brings other players in and can score goals. So they're of that type, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Did he propel them to success at all? How well did they get on?
He didn't do with Spartak, unfortunately.
No.
As I say, they only spent 3 years in the Campionati, which was the national championship of Albania. But he did have success with Partizan. And initially with Vlasnia, he won the league with those in 1946, and then he went on to win a couple of Superligas with Partizan and several cups with them as well. So he didn't have success with Spartak, but he did have a lot of success with Partizan.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, he was controversially robbed off. Robbed might be a bit of a stretch, but Partizan used their army leverage, I suppose you could say, to get him. Is that correct, Phil?
There was a specific way of transferring players during that time period, and basically it benefited what I would call the super clubs, who were like Partizan and Dynamo, because they had ties to the military and the police. When a player was called up for national service, they would be prized away from the club that they played for. So in Barici's kind of context, he was playing for Vlasnia, so he was signed up for national service, which meant that he automatically, for 2 years, had to play for either Partizan or Dynamo. And Partizan came in and said, like, you're playing for us. They took him off Vlasnia. And for 2 years, he played for them. And when the option came for him to rejoin Vlasnia, that's when Partizan would offer financial sweetness to get him to play. So it would be like, we'll give you a nice new flat. It would never be monetary, but they'd offer you kind of an easier job with less hours and a nice new flat. And that's how those teams kind of signed all the kind of mint talent in Albania at the time. They just kind of signed them if they were on national service, and then afterwards they offered them financial sweeteners to kind of stay at the club. And that's what happened with Barici. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see, Rory. So like in my research of the book, you could see why maybe Spartak Tirana are in the book, because they were kind of pushed out. There's so many clubs in Tirana, though. I'm not 100% sure on the amount. Maybe Phil knows how many, but there's so many, and they're all playing in one stadium at one point, I think.
They were playing in the Kemal Staffar from 1946 to 1961. So you had at one stage there were 5 kind of Tirana-based teams. There was another Tirana team called Luftatari Tirana, who were alongside Spartak, who were alongside Partizan, alongside 17 Nendori. Yeah. They all played in the Campionati at the same time in the same stadium. So, as you can imagine, like the fixture kind of
the country of derbies, basically.
Yeah. Every other week, generally. But then, that's why they had to build the Dynamo Stadium, which is now the Salman Stamasi. In 1961, that eventually opened, and that became a secondary stadium in Tirana.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple instances I know of rival teams sharing stadiums, and I guess it's maybe just because of the football and culture that I could not imagine the thought. I just think it would just be so bizarre, almost like you don't. It is your home, but it's also not your home. It's everyone else's home as well. So it might just be the circumstances of where they were, but it's not something that I could deal with, I don't think.
Yeah.
Every club needs their own home almost,
I think it's indicative of what Albania was at the time. It was you had to kind of toe the line, and sport was seen. Although it was very passionate, it was as passionate as any other country. It was a kind of recreational pastime, and everyone shook their hands at the end of the game. There was, everyone towed the line. So it was just part of life, I think. Although there's lots of documented occasions where things didn't quite go like that in Albania, which I'm presently documenting in the book that I'm presently writing on Albanian football history. There's a lot to unpick there. There's a lot of great stories, a lot of unbelievable kind of instances that happen there. It's a really interesting story.
Mm-hmm. No, I've no doubt, and I look forward to reading that when it comes out. It sounds really, really interesting. So, am I right in saying the club initially folded in 1957?
1959.
1959. Okay.
Formed in 1950 and folded in 1959.
Okay. So, we'll call them the Phoenix Club. So, did the Phoenix Club, founded in 2012, did they have much success, or are they very much the case that they were kind of batting around the lower echelons of Albanian football? They still are, or did they manage to rise to any prominence?
No, they spent most of the time in the third tier of Albanian football, and never made it to the top tier. So yeah, and they lasted for an even shorter period of time than the initial incarnation. They only lasted for 8 years. So and then they dissolved as well. So, leaving behind great stories, but in total between the two sides, they were in existence for only 17 years.
It's amazing because obviously, they've got their player and stuff like that, but 17 years, no trophies, yet they've left such an impression and obviously grabbed both of your guys' attention to be able to write about it. It's fascinating. Genuinely, I find it so interesting how just a club that has, on the face of it, had very little success can just have that big an impact, and how its name can still be recognised and heard today. I think it's a great thing. It really is.
Yeah, I think it's just football nostalgists' kind of interest in the remote and the unique and the path less trodden that takes us there, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Phil Rock, have you got any last things to add just before we move on?
No, just that it was a chapter that I really enjoyed. Mostly thanks to Phil there, who helped me along greatly with the research and stuff like that, and gave me even more insights to the actual club. You're dead right, Rory. You asked me earlier what successes do they have? In truth, they didn't really have any success on the pitch with trophies or anything like that. But yet they still, left their mark on football. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to get with most of the clubs that I wrote about, that, just you don't have to be successful. Like, you don't have to be this huge club like Man United, Barcelona to leave an impression in the footballing world. There's so many football clubs out there that have left impressions with football fans, their own and, rival fans, I'd say, would remember KF Spartak Tirana as well. But certainly one of the more interesting stories that I wrote about, and Albanian football has definitely piqued my interest because of it.
So now we are going to move on. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about a team from Belarus called FC Partizan Minsk. Phil O'Rourke, do you want to tell us a little bit about them just before I kick off?
Yeah, look, another club that I kind of just stumbled upon. When I was doing my research, I tried to spread it about. Obviously, these former Soviet countries, a lot of forgotten clubs, if you like, from these areas because of political reasons, really, and you'll see that they were a relatively new club that only popped up. So I did try to make a mix of, we have Spartak Tirana there that were founded back in the 30s and stuff like that, and were gone by 1959. This club were founded actually in 2002 as MTZ Ripo Minsk, they were known as when they first started. And you will get that an awful lot in these countries and these clubs changing their names and stuff like that. Again, political reasons, as Phil alluded to. There was 8 clubs in the second tier in Albania changed their name from Puna, which meant workers, to different names because they had to really politically, maybe were forced to. So you do get that a lot. But so they started off as MTZ or IPO. Now I don't know if that's RIPO or if it's RIPO, but Minsk. And the club was formed after 2 clubs in the city of Minsk merged. So again, you're seeing this merging kind of stuff that happens an awful lot in these European countries. As I mentioned in the first episode, in Ireland, it doesn't happen an awful lot, merges. And I don't think it really happens an awful lot in the UK in general, in England and Scotland or Wales. I think it's a real European thing. As you'll find out from other clubs that we'll talk about, even from countries like Germany and stuff like that. Again, I think it's more of a political thing, and
I think it can maybe depend on a few things because, sorry, excuse me, obviously a little bit about teams merging in last week's episode and how it can maybe, in the case of FC Amsterdam, you combine 2 sets of fans who maybe had a bit of animosity towards each other. They completely changed the names of those 2 clubs. It's almost like erasing history and erasing the kind of identities that those fans have, which is obviously an issue, to try and create some kind of new venture. One of the reasons that I chose Partizan Minsk is because I actually quite liked the reason behind the merger. So obviously, founded as MTZ Ripo Minsk, they merged with a kind of more well-established team because MTZ were founded in 2002, but Tractor Minsk, who they merged with, were founded in 1947. So it was almost like this new team kind of merging with the established old. But Tractor Minsk ended up merging with Trudovie Rezervi. So Tractor Minsk were obviously this sort of established side, well known, had been around for a long time, and Trudovie Rezervi were an academy side. Now, the reason that they ended up merging is so that they could get the financial benefits and the financial backing of Minsk. Also, kind of develop, like having this youth academy base. It almost seems like it would go hand in hand. You know what I mean? Like I quite like the reasons behind the merger for this one. It seemed really quite interesting.
They were basically getting the best of both worlds from say Tractor Minsk had the financial muscle, while Trudovia basically had the academy set up, facilities and stuff like that. And they said, all right, well, you have this, we have this, why not just get together? And that's where MTZ Ripo Minsk basically came from. And look, it was a bit of a success story straight away because they got promoted in their first season. So it obviously worked out well from the start.
Yeah, absolutely. Promoted in their first season, and in their reasonably short history if you go by the merger. Managed to win the Belarusian Cup twice, and the first time they won the cup was a shock. It was a cup set because they beat Bate Borisov, who are obviously quite a well-known Belarusian team, and then they were obviously beaten by MTZ Repo Minsk for them to win their first title. And obviously, they're up in the Premier Division, or the first tier. Absolutely loving life. They did enjoy quite a lot of success outside of that, because often when these teams pop up, they'll maybe win a cup here and there or get to a final, and then they'll end up collapsing back down the leagues. But they done okay in Europe, I suppose, for their size and the fact they got there for the first time. So their European debut after they won the cup, they won the Belarusian Cup, and that gave them entrance into the UEFA Cup in the qualifying rounds. So the first team that they came up against was Hungarian side Ferencváros. Repo Minsk beat them away from home 2-0, but lost the second leg at home 2-1. But obviously that was enough to see them through on aggregate. And then in the next round, they came up against a side from Czechia called FK Teplice. I've probably absolutely. Yeah. And unfortunately, they lost 3-2 on aggregate in that one. So their European journey came to an end. But the next season, they were able to get back into Europe again. They'd won the Belarusian Cup again. So they were able to get back into that. And this time they came up against Shakhtar Karaganda. And they beat them 5-1 in their first game, which was fantastic. That's a great result. What a way to kick off your European adventure. But then when they went to Karaganda to play, they lost. Karaganda came to Minsk to play them, and they ended up losing 3-1. But again, it was still enough to see them through. So they got lucky, but they were made to sweat a little bit because of that. As you would obviously, these are quite intense ties. After that, they came up against FC Moscow, who'd only been founded in 2004. They themselves only lasted about 6 years. So that proved to be a little bit too much for them. So Moscow won 3-0 in aggregate, and they were knocked out in the second round. They missed out on playing Europe in the next season. They finished fourth in the league. That was in 2006, behind Shakhtar Sologorsk, who finished third. They had a few flashpoints with Sologorsk over their history. I believe they played them in a cup final and they managed to beat them. So they got a little bit of revenge for that. But in the 2006 season, 3 Repo Minsk players actually finished amongst the top 7 goal scorers in the league. Vyacheslav Hleb, brother of former Arsenal and Barca winger Alexander Hleb. The others were Artem Kontsevoy and Oleg Stojanovic, who had a bit of a journeyman's career, shall we say, going around clubs in Belarus and Ukraine and some in Russia as well. So in 2007, they finished 5th, but they managed to qualify for the 2008 UEFA Cup due to their triumph in the Belarus Cup. Now, if I remember correctly, 2008 was the last year it was called the UEFA Cup. So they managed to get entry to that as well. As I said, they beat Sologorsk in the cup final. They beat them 2-1. They had a bit of a shaky end to the game when Sologorsk equalised, but they replied pretty much immediately. I think they equalised quite close to full time, maybe in the 82nd minute, something like that. So it was quite late on, but they had an immediate reply and they managed to win. So that got them entry back into Europe. But unfortunately, this time they were knocked out in the first round by a Slovakian team, Zelina. They won 3-2 in aggregate again. And they went on to have a third place finish and gain qualification for the Europa League in the 2008 season. And Artem Kontsevoy had a really, really good season. He bagged 15, which is, fantastic. And he'd also scored against Bate Borisov, Sologorsk. He'd scored against a number of big teams. So they were really pulling their weight and they were holding their own in this big league. And obviously they've not been around for very, very long. At this point, they'd only been around for 6 years. So, they're doing pretty well for a club that's only just been founded. And obviously they went into the Europa League again. They played against the Montenegrin side, Sujeska Niskic. Mm-hmm. Well, that time went to extra time, that tie. It was 2 each on aggregate at the end of the 90 in the second leg. He got the winner in the 111th minute, which is always great to see, causes great scenes. And then they went into the second round to play Metalurg Donetsk, and they were absolutely outplayed. They got beat 3-0 in Donetsk. And they gave it a go in the next leg, but Metalor took the lead in the 16th minute and basically killed the tie. Now, 2009 was when things started to go a little bit downhill for them, and there's a few reasons for that. So they started falling down the leagues, and they ended up getting relegated, and they had to play a playoff. It was a bit, I suppose, a bit weird because there's a couple of times in Partizan Minsk's history where they had been the top of the leagues in the first division and the Belarusian Premier Division, where they could have won the league, and they actually had superior goal difference to the team who were tied with them in points. Made them play a one-off tie, and I think they won when they were in the second tier, but they lost when they were in the first tier. Wouldn't you say that's quite unfair?
Yeah. Again, these kind of formats and stuff like that, well, they changed year on year. Like when I'm doing research on these type of in these countries and stuff like that, more so probably in South America. South America was really, really difficult to follow. But in some of these countries, as former Soviet Union countries and stuff like that, it was kind of like, because most of them were only established in their independent leagues in 1991, 92, they were still trying to find the kind of format or structure, even into the early 2000s and late 2000s, 12, 15 years on. They're still trying to find some sort of structure that they can just continue on. But it was ever changing, and I think, yeah, you could argue, and I'm sure the Minsk fans will definitely argue and say it was unfair, but unfortunately, that was just the kind of way it fell. I don't think it was against them as a club. I think they were just unlucky to fall into these kind of restructuring kind of formats at the time, basically, by the Belarusian FA.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. So, maybe a little bit hard done by in those cases, but as you say, there was some restructuring going on and other things kind of happening at the time. Now, they started falling down the leagues, and they didn't, am I right in saying they didn't actually get promoted back up from the first division once they fell down to it?
No, they took their time, whereas some clubs who, get relegated and bounce right back up. No, Minsk, it was a little bit of a different story with them, to be fair. Whether that was the kind of the start of kind of the off-field demise, you can't really tell. But I would suggest that there was probably something more to it, because they went down, but they were still a decent club, and most would have expected them to come back up nearly straight away, but it wasn't to be.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to come on to, the on-field issues, because there's a similar timeline that I'd quite like to bring up here. So, either of you familiar with a gentleman by the name of Vladimir Romanov?
Yeah, of course I am. As I mentioned in the book, Hearts fans will definitely know Romanov. Probably UK fans. Phil, would you be familiar with him?
Yeah, he was involved in Belarusian and Lithuanian football, wasn't he? He was the ugly oligarch who took Hearts almost to the title, and then tore them apart afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he actually owned this club as well, Phil. So as you can imagine, we're not going to have a happy ending.
No, exactly, and I think you actually mentioned it in the book, because it was weird, because obviously you're talking Scottish football in the kind of mid to late 2000s. Not a lot of people are going to have a lot. Well, I mean, as far as I'm aware, obviously we're not going to paint everyone with the same brush, but Lithuanian and Belarusian football aren't going to be at the forefront of everyone's minds. Let's just say that.
No. So
all of a sudden, this big Russian billionaire rocks up and buys Hearts, okay, and they're thinking, great, this is brilliant. We're going to be, top of the league. We're going to split Celtic and Rangers, and we're going to start putting some Edinburgh dominance in the map and all that kind of stuff. And as you said, Phil Harrison, it started off really, really well, because they had money and they were spending it. But one thing that was kind of interesting as well at the start, and it kind of continued the whole way, was that Vladimir Romanov was quite a big fan of loaning players between the teams that he owned. So all of a sudden, Hearts had this absolute contingent of Lithuanian and Belarusian players just come out of nowhere, and some of them were brilliant, and some of them were absolutely dross. Like really, like must have won a competition to be able to play. he was quite a big fan of doing that, but it eventually got to the point where the clubs were kind of buying players from each other. Now, in the case of Hearts, it goes on and on and on, and their financial troubles, or rumours of their financial troubles, sort of start around 2010, 2011, I think it was, where basically they're in so much debt to Romanov because of this constant sort of like internal cycle of spending between the clubs that he owns. It gets to around 2012, where the club are trying to find a new buyer. And by 2013, 2014, they end up getting relegated, and they get saved from liquidation by the Foundation of Hearts, who are an absolutely fantastic group of people, by the way. Basically, a group of fans who realised they wouldn't have a club unless they saved it, more or less, and they managed to get the money together to actually save Hearts and turn it into a fan-owned club. To some degree, it's not really like that at the moment, but it's still there in some degree. They still have quite a big say in things. That happened to Hearts, who are a pretty well-known Scottish team, and unfortunately, I have the feeling that the same thing happened to Partizan Minsk, because Romanov sort of ran into legal and money trouble, and for a while he completely disappeared.
Yeah,
which was really, really bizarre, because he just, like, you know, people at Hearts and I assume these other teams are trying to speak to him, and he just completely vanished. And basically, I think it seems like a case that obviously the club had its on-field issues and they got relegated. And even in leagues across the world, we all know that maybe a little bit bigger again. But if you take Sunderland, for an example, they all said how they kind of struggled to cope with being essentially still financially a Premier League club in terms of the wages they were spending and the monies they were spending, but having the infrastructure of a League One club, or having to adapt to that. So I can imagine it's the same in other leagues as well, where if you start cannonballing down the leagues, then you're going to need to try and adapt pretty quickly. Otherwise, you're going to run into some serious issues.
Yeah.
So obviously that was going on, and then the rug was basically just pulled from underneath them, and the money was gone.
Yeah, he as you mentioned there, Rory, he ran into legal problems of his own, and abandoned the club. Left them there. They couldn't afford. They had no financial backing at all. They couldn't afford a license for the Premier League, so therefore were thrown out. And yeah, they just had no money. And unfortunately, the fans, unlike Hearts, who had the Hearts Foundation, as you said, unfortunately the money wasn't there with the fans with Partizan Minsk. And they went, as I said, they were gone, but they did make a comeback in 2013. They renamed themselves again Partizan MTZ Minsk. So a bit of a mix match of their names back in the day. But unfortunately, that didn't take off, and they were once again dissolved and gone from the footballing world. It's amazing that, you know, one man can just dictate a whole football club like that. That he just said, "I'm having." Well, not that he said he's having enough. I'd say other people said that to him. But you know, once he abandoned the club, they were gone. And he did abandon them. He didn't go looking for any buyers. He didn't try say, "Look, I'm gonna, you know, make sure they're stable before I go," which is what normal owners do. Not every owner, of course, but he just seemed like a shady character, and one that, you know, didn't belong in football. I used the word portfolio when I describe the clubs he had. So he had a Lithuanian club, he had Partizan Minsk, he had Hearts. It was almost like he was collecting football clubs, and as you said, transferring players from one club. It was almost like a game to him. And as we know, rich owners, football clubs, playing games, it never ends well. And you'd be dead right, Rory, it didn't have a happy ending.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can almost draw. I don't know. A lot of people will probably disagree, but you can almost kind of draw a comparison to Chelsea, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, no, there's not really any issues, so to speak, that's risen with Todd Bowley, but I mean, they are hemorrhaging money at a frightening rate, and they are spending huge amounts, and it's not working for them.
No, and if he pulled out of Chelsea, now I look, I would imagine it'd be a different story with Chelsea, because I think to be buyers for Chelsea, I think they would pull themselves out. But unfortunately for a lot of clubs around Europe, like Partizan Minsk and clubs like that, obviously clubs that I've written about and researched about, they didn't have that resource. So if they have, look, even Spartak Fingal, who had Jerry Gannon backing them, and then once he was pulled out because he got in financial difficulties, that was that. And unfortunately, this is a common theme. You know, it's all great having a rich owner and stuff like that, and you know he's bankrolling and you know you're winning trophies and all this malark. But once he gets bored or if he runs into any troubles with his other companies, because he is going to have other businesses, they're not, you know, they don't make their money out of football. Very rarely, you know, there's not a lot of money to be made in football.
Yeah, it's very rare if a club ever you know truly turns a profit.
Exactly.
They're almost always operating at a loss because that's just the kind of business that they're involved in.
Yeah, and because it is, you're always running the risk. And look, you have to remember these rich owners like Romanov there, like Jerry Gannon and all, they've no real obligation to keep the football club going. So at the end of the day, these football clubs are just assets to them. If they become financially in trouble, the first thing they're going to do is, right, well, what do I have that I can use as leverage to get myself out of financial trouble? Oh, I have a football club. Now, in this stage, in this regard, he didn't use the football club because I'd imagine the football club was in severe debt anyway, so it probably was worth nothing. So he just took the second escape route, the second door, and went, I'm just going to leave it behind. I'm just leaving it behind, and that's that. And unfortunately, these are you know, that's the theme of a lot of the clubs that I featured, that they did have a rich owner. The fans were great, delighted and all at the time. But then the rich owner got bored or got in trouble and just was on his toes. But it's something that I think fans nowadays are trying to stop. They're awakening to it. They're kind of more cautious when they hear that a rich owner is coming in to take over their football club. They're kind of like, oh, hang on, no, that didn't work for other clubs. We don't want the sole responsibility to fall on one man's shoulders, and that's why I think you're seeing an awful lot of clubs being fan owned, or even in Germany, for example, the 51% rule, where the fan, so that'll always protect the club, and that's the way it is now. One owner clubs, you know, it works sometimes. Look, we're looking at Liverpool there with John Henry. You look at Todd Bowley. I think it's more difficult for them lads to walk away because they're in such a high-profile position, like the Glazers and all. Like the Glazers ain't going to turn around and go, right, good luck, lads, we're gone. You know, because the whole world is looking at it, and they'd probably be, you know, have to hide themselves from assassination because there's so many fans. Like, where it's probably easier for Romanov to go, Partizan Minsk, yeah, good luck, nobody knows anything about them, and just walk away. And that's no disrespect to Partizan Minsk, because at the end of the day, they're a football club. They had football fans that loved them, and they were part of people's lives, and he basically just disregarded it. And because of that, I've no sympathy for any financial difficulties that he did get himself in.
Absolutely.
But that'd be my 2 pence in it.
It's interesting as well, because I've always thought, you know, obviously within the last sort of decade or so, we've had Red Bull obviously founding numerous teams. So you've got Salzburg, you've got Leipzig, you did have Red Bull Brazil, you've now got Red Bull Bragantino, something like that.
Yeah, in Brazil, they were in the second division and Red Bull took them over and they're getting them promoted. So they actually are aiming to have a club in every continent in the world. So they have one, I think they have one in Japan.
What would happen if, you know, and it probably doesn't work like this. I know it doesn't work like this, but for example, if Red Bull got a new CEO or a new director or something, he came in and he said, and he just decided, I'm stopping all football operations immediately. And, you know, I know that these teams, particularly Leipzig, get a bit of a slagging because, you know, they've just been founded out of nothing. They've had this huge financial backing from day dot. And then people, you know, say, well, you've not really got a history, so how can you call yourselves a football team and stuff like that? But at the end of the day, there are still people that are going along to support them.
Just when you're on that point there is a football club in the book from China, which we will speak about. We might speak about them in the next episode or in the next couple of episodes. They were taken over by the Sunning Company, Sunning Limited.
Yes, that's right.
And basically, they were around since the 1950s. They won the league in 2021, and then Sunning just stopped all football operations, and that was that. They were gone. Because somebody decided in the higher echelons of Sunning that they just didn't want a football department, and like that, 70 years of history, 70 odd years of history gone. One league title, and that stands. So I suppose that answers your question. If Red Bull had employed the CEO who said, let's take apart our, I'd say it'd be more complicated than that, but let's take apart our football department. You know, it has happened, and Sunning are a perfect example of that, and a club that we will talk about in depth in future episodes.
Yeah. Phil Harrison, any thoughts just before we start wrapping up?
Yeah, well, in regard to that, I'm not a fan of franchise football. I'm not particularly a fan of modern football. If you ever go to my Twitter site, you'll see my my front page on my Twitter site. It says against modern football. So all of the footballers and all of the games and all the clubs that I love are in the past, though. So. I observe modern football, but I don't really follow it. And if I do go and watch a game, it's generally non-league football. So in regards to the modern story of football, I don't like the way it's going, and but at least I'm not involved.
No, well, that's the thing, and I mean, obviously, Newcastle were bought over by a Saudi consortium last year, and now a Qatari consortium are looking to put a bid in for Manchester United. It looks like, or I think there's been rumours that they've kind of confirmed that. And someone said to me at the time, it's not going to be long before these huge sort of oil-rich countries are going to be running the Premier League. But I said to them, I said, well, but the Premier League's been like this for a while, because it doesn't matter what country they're from, they're still going to be rich consortiums. It doesn't matter what nationality they are, they're still rich consortiums. So it's going to have the exact same effect, whoever it is and wherever they're from. And I think that people have only started to open their eyes to it because it's not an American person or it's not a British person. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I totally understand. I just, success meted out because of what's in CEO's bank account. It's just not. It's not what football, it's not what football should be, and it's not the kind of football that I want to be invested in.
Yeah, the future of football is depressing. So we'll stick to the history and we'll stick to the past and the present. That's exactly what we'll do. Tonight we have covered KF Spartak Tirana and FC Partizan Minsk. Another two forgotten football clubs who were lost, one due to political reasons mainly, and the other because of a rich owner who, as we just discussed, just basically left them for dead. So again, next week we'll be back. We'll be picking another two clubs from the book at random, and we'll be discussing them and their stories. And as I said earlier on, we'll go on the Twitter and we'll announce our winner who won the giveaway from last week. But for now, I'll say goodbye. Phil, do you want to say goodbye as well?
Yeah, goodbye all. Yeah, thanks for listening.
Goodbye, and we'll have you back for the next episode.
It's a big thank you from me as well. See you next week. Thank you and goodbye.